The teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect.
Today, we are going to be messing with your mind, or at least talking about some unethical experiments from history that messed with people's minds.
Pretty dark stuff. Let's get right into it.
We're kicking things off with Project Artichoke. This was a series of experiments carried out by the CIA beginning in 1951, exploring whether or not someone could be mentally controlled to the point of carrying out an action against their will. In a memo outlining the project in 1952, the main goal of the project was to apparently answer whether they could, quote, get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation. Creepy. The tests were carried out in secret locations overseas throughout Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. Test subjects were given hallucinogenic substances, you can probably guess which, kept in total isolation for prolonged periods of time, and were subjected to hypnosis and psychological torment. Some experiments were also carried out on unwitting agents. Some were kept on hallucinogens for up to 77 days straight. That sounds like hell. So what exactly was the goal here? What were they attempting to actually have the test subjects do? Well, the end goal was for the hypnosis to work to the point where they could have control over an individual to such a point that they could command them to terminate prominent enemy politicians.
Next up on our list today, we have Project QKHILLTOP, which was created to study Chinese brainwashing techniques in order to develop more effective methods of interrogation. It was actually a sub-project of MKUltra carried out by the CIA, and it started in 1954. And it was spearheaded by Harold G. Wolff, if anyone cares. The experiment, which was carried out on prisoners of the Korean War, had 4 stages. The first was an assault on the individual's identity. For months, prisoners were physically and mentally tormented, all while being told they weren't actually the person that they thought they were. This was, of course, an attempt to break their sense of self along with their grasp on reality. The CIA then moved on to stage 2, attempting to convince the prisoners that they were the bad guys and making them feel guilt for their participation in the war. Stage 3, test subjects would begin to comply with the CIA's wishes, doubting their sense of self and agreeing that they had acted wrongly by engaging in the conflict and fighting against the United States rather than for the United States. And stage 4, the prisoners were given illicit substances so that the United States could test the effect of different substances on mood and corresponding levels of cooperation. Really, nothing good came of it, and if I'm being honest, it kind of seems like this whole thing was just some kind of weird psychotic fantasy that was played out under the guise of public safety. I'm just not buying it.
The Monster Study is one of the darkest psychological studies in American history. Many of the test subjects suffered from lifelong repercussions. This quote-unquote study was conducted in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa. The purpose was to investigate the effects of negative speech therapy on speech development. The researchers selected 22 orphans, some of which had stuttering problems, then divided them into 2 groups. One group received positive and encouraging speech therapy and feedback, while the other group received negative therapy. In the negative therapy group, the orphans were told that they had speech problems and were discouraged and belittled. And surprise, surprise, the negative therapy had some consequences. Some of the test subjects in this negative therapy group developed self-esteem issues and even developed speech problems, even though some of them didn't even have any before the study began. And a lot of them carried all this stuff into adulthood. And to top it all off, the subjects hadn't even been informed of the true nature of the study. They were told they'd be receiving regular speech therapy.
Next up, we have the Aversion Project. Much like the others, it's super messed up. In the 1970s and 80s, South Africa's segregated army forced many of their white, lesbian, and gay soldiers to undergo a sex change operation. Officials would actively seek out homosexuals in the armed forces and discreetly send them to unethical military psychiatric units with unethical military military doctors who would attempt to turn the soldiers straight through the use of illicit substances, aversion shock therapy, and hormone treatment. And if all that didn't work, soldiers would undergo either chemical castration if they were male or sex change operations if they were female. The majority of individuals who underwent the forced procedures were in their early 20s and had been forced into the army against their will. Many individuals died during the surgeries, and many others did not receive proper treatment after the surgeries were completed, leading to extreme complications in the healing process. The head of the operation, Dr. Aubrey Levin, moved to Canada, actually, and continued to practice psychiatry until he was sentenced to 5 years in prison on January 28th of 2013. It took that long. He was sentenced after violating a number of his patients. He since got out and he's living in a halfway house.
The Milgram Experiment was a pretty fascinating one, but very unsettling. The experiment set out to test how far people would go against their own morals in order to follow authority, even when believing you could be causing someone physical harm. Yale University social psychology professor Stanley Milgram carried out the project in 1961. Participants were recruited to take part in what they believed was a study on learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher, while another person, who was secretly an actor, played the role of the learner. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks to the learner whenever they gave incorrect answers to a memory task. Now, the electric shocks weren't actually real. Again, the learner was an actor pretending to be in pain, but the experiment was designed to see if the teacher would continue to administer these increasingly severe shocks as ordered by the experimenter, despite all the screams of pain and terror coming from the learner. And the creepy part, even through the learner's screams and pleas to stop, a big majority of participants continued to administer shocks up to the highest level on the shock generator just because they were instructed to do so.
Next up, we have Harlow's Pit of Despair. You know that book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? It's kind of like that, but instead of giving a mouse a cookie, you take a monkey's mom away. I guess it's not really the same thing. Anyways, the experiment took place in the 1960s, and it was designed to better understand the effects of attachment on the development of young minds. In the experiment, infant monkeys were separated from their real mothers and were instead raised by wire mothers made of, well, wire, and cloth mothers made of cloth. The wire monkey had food and the cloth monkey was warm. The infantile monkeys, the real ones that were alive, always went for the cloth mother every time, except for, of course, mealtime, and that was the only time they ever went to the wire mother, was for food. In some variations of the experiment, the monkeys were placed in an isolation chamber for anywhere from a few days to as long as 10 weeks. Almost immediately, the monkeys would begin huddling in the corner and would remain motionless for the majority of their stay in the chambers. The monkeys in the experiment became so incapable of interacting with other monkeys that when it came time to mate, scientists would strap the affected monkeys down to a rack and have an unaffected monkey, you know. Anyways, the female monkeys who gave birth were unable to care for their young due to the extreme psychological torment they'd experienced throughout their lives. You might have heard of this in school, but I bet they didn't tell you all that. Or maybe they did. I only took Psych 101.
It's hard to imagine that something like World War II could really happen. How could an entire population follow one of the most tyrannical rulers in history? It's hard to wrap your head around it, and in order to teach his students firsthand, one teacher at Gubberly High School in California carried out a pretty disturbing experiment in 1967. One that could have easily gotten way out of hand if it had been allowed to go on any longer. He created a simulated totalitarian regime within the classroom with the motto strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action, strength through pride. Originally, he'd only intended for this experiment to go on for one day, but he was fascinated with how quickly the students seemed to take to all these new strict rules. So he let it continue into the next day, and then the next and next. He implemented symbols of unity like a hand gesture resembling a certain salute, and encouraged students to report deviant behavior to him. Members began recruiting students from other classes, and the third wave movement, as Jones called it, which started with a class of like 30-something students, quickly became a 200 student strong movement, and things took a dark turn as this sense of unity and conformity led to discrimination, exclusion, and students suppressing each other's individual freedoms within the group. It had taken on this life of its own, and Jones decided he had to abruptly end the experiment only after 5 days before things completely spiraled out of control. interesting experiment, gotta say, but definitely creepy.
Next up, we have the UCLA Schizophrenia experiments. In 1983, research began at the university designed to better understand the signs of relapse in patients who suffered from schizophrenia. A large number of diagnosed schizophrenics taking preventative medications were brought in for the study. Researchers began reducing their medication to test the effect it would have on the mental state of their patients, and as you can probably guess, it didn't go well. Many patients quickly began experiencing delusions, hallucinations, psychosis, paranoia, and insomnia, among other negative symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Not surprisingly, there were no procedures in place during the experiment that would protect the mental state of the patients, and despite the negative side effects growing each time medication was reduced, the reductions kept coming. The experiment lasted years until in 1991 a test subject by the name of Antonio Lamadrid threw himself off the roof of one of the UCLA buildings. A lawsuit found the university to be not responsible for Lamadrid's death. Wild, but it was concluded that the experiments were unethical and that they lacked informed consent, and so the project was terminated, as it should be.
And of course, MKUltra. This was a top secret project carried out by the CIA during the 50s and 60s. It was pretty much the continuation of Project Artichoke. Its goal was to explore techniques for mind control and interrogation. MKUltra used a wide range of experiments, including the use of illicit substances, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torment. The ultimate goal was to develop methods of influencing and then manipulating human behavior and extracting information through the use of psychology. The experiments were obviously highly unethical here, violating basic human rights. Participants included unwitting civilians, military personnel, and prisoners who were all subjected to extreme psychological and physical harm without their informed consent. They were administered mind-altering substances, leading to unpredictable and often traumatic experiences for the subjects involved. There was very little oversight or accountability here. Many documents related to the project were destroyed or classified as well, and the true extent of MKUltra only came to light through investigations in the 70s.
And finally, we have the Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, an experiment was conducted in order to better understand the psychological implications of power dynamics. University students were recruited to play either guards or prisoners. The assignments were random, 12 prisoners, 12 guards, and then, without warning, those assigned prisoners were arrested, fingerprinted, blindfolded, and driven to a makeshift prison. There, they were stripped naked and instructed to change into prison uniforms. Subjects assigned the role of guards arrived at the prison and were given military-style uniforms, dark glasses, whistles, and clubs, and they were instructed to do whatever they believed was necessary in order to control those playing the role of inmates. On day one, confrontational behavior had already begun. Guards raided prison cells and woke inmates up in the middle of the night for attendance checks. By night two, the inmates had had enough, and so they barricaded themselves inside their cells. When the guards found out, they were not happy. They sprayed the inmates down with fire extinguishers, stripped them of their clothes, and took their beds. After that, the inmates became pretty submissive, but the guards only got more aggressive. The experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks, but after just 5 days it ended due to the extreme behaviors that were taking place. Both the prisoners and the guards, surprisingly, suffered lasting trauma from the ordeal, experiencing flashbacks, severe anxiety, and some people even developed PTSD. It's been
Thank
fun.
you so much for joining us
Of course.
in this long, grueling experiment.
I've been your host, Hannah Thompson.
I've been your host, James.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to break it to you, Hannah, but your entire time here at Most Amazing Top 10 has been one big experiment.
Oh my gosh, you guys.
One big crank.
Wow. Is it ethical?
I don't know. That's you to judge.
It might end up on the next list, you guys.